850 tanks rolling across Greek training grounds on any given exercise day, more main battle tanks in active service than France and Britain have combined. Two nations with significantly larger populations, significantly larger economies, and, on paper at least, significantly larger reasons to field a bigger armored force than a country roughly the size of a single, mid-sized American state. A country most people couldn't confidently place on a list of the world's major military powers if asked directly. Germany built the Leopard 1 tank. Germany designed it from the ground up in the early 1960s, in the depths of the Cold War, at a moment when European military planners on both sides of the Iron Curtain were obsessed with a single terrifying scenario playing out over and over in staff college war games. A massed, Warsaw-packed, armored assault pouring through the plains of central Germany, the famous Fulda Gap, a potential invasion route that shaped an entire generation of NATO tank design, doctrine, and defensive planning. Every design choice in the Leopard 1, its speed, its armor profile, its gun, was made with that exact scenario in mind. Germany manufactured the Leopard 1 domestically, in German factories, employing German engineers and German industrial workers, and fielded it as the literal backbone of its own national defense posture for decades, positioning it directly on the front line of a divided continent, where the distance between peace and a full continental war was measured, at certain tense moments, in mere kilometers and mere hours. If any country on Earth had a legitimate claim to being the true home and rightful owner of the Leopard tank, both in spirit and in raw numbers, it was West Germany, the nation whose engineers designed it, whose factories built it, and whose soldiers were meant to crew it in the war everyone hoped, desperately, would never actually come. And yet by the time the dust settles on who actually owns the most Leopard 1 tanks today, decades later, long after the Cold War itself has ended, and the Soviet threat that justified the Leopard's very existence has dissolved entirely into history, it isn't Germany holding the largest fleet of its own signature tank. It's Greece, a country roughly the size of the US state of Alabama, with a population smaller than the state of Ohio, holding more Leopard 1 tanks in active service than any other nation on the planet, including the country that built them in the first place. The same country whose own army formally retired the entire Leopard 1 type from frontline service back in 2003, judging it obsolete for its own modern defense needs, even while Greece continued expanding its own Leopard fleet for years afterward, buying up exactly the tanks Germany itself no longer wanted. To understand how this actually happens, you first have to understand what Greece's tank fleet looked like before a single Leopard ever arrived on Greek soil, because this story doesn't begin with German tanks at all. It begins with American ones, and with a broader pattern of Cold War alliance politics that most people watching this have never had explained to them in any real detail. For decades, the backbone of the Hellenic Army's armored force was the M47 Patton, an American Cold War-era design already considered aging by the standards of the 1970s. A tank whose basic combat concept traced back to hard lessons learned in the Korean War just a few years earlier, with roughly 396 vehicles in Greek service at their peak strength, forming the core of Greek armored doctrine for a full generation of Greek soldiers. Behind them came 390 M48A5 tanks, later upgraded to a Greek-specific standard designated MOLF, incorporating a modular laser fire control system developed by the electronics firm Econ, a system that would later share roughly 80% of its underlying components, with the fire control systems eventually fitted to Greece's own Leopard fleet decades afterward, a detail that reveals something important about how Greece approached this entire process. This wasn't scattered, opportunistic buying. It was methodical, standardized fleet planning across multiple tank generations, decades apart, unified by shared electronics architecture wherever practically possible. Behind those came 357 M60A1 Rise tanks and a further 312 M60A3 TTS tanks, arriving in Greek service around 1991 and 1992 under a specific mechanism worth understanding on its own terms rather than lumping in with everything else. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, signed as the Cold War wound down, mandated significant reductions in the number of tanks and heavy weapons NATO and former Warsaw Pact nations could station in Central Europe. Rather than simply scrapping thousands of now surplus tanks to meet these treaty limits, a so-called cascading program allowed Western nations to transfer this surplus equipment onward to Allied nations positioned outside the treaty's core geographic zone. Greece, sitting on NATO's southeastern flank, well outside the specific Central European region the treaty targeted, became a natural and strategically justified recipient of exactly this kind of surplus cascade. It's a detail that genuinely matters for understanding this whole story honestly, because it shows this wasn't purely a story of Greece aggressively hunting down every available tank on Earth out of some singular national obsession. Some of this early fleet expansion happened simply because a treaty in an entirely different part of Europe created a surplus that needed a new home, and Greece, given its position and its NATO membership, was both willing and geographically logical. That positioning matters enormously to this entire story, and it's genuinely worth pausing here to understand why, in real depth. Greece occupies a strategic junction in European geography that very few other countries can genuinely match. It borders the Balkans to the north, a region that spent much of the 20th century as a genuine recurring flashpoint of European conflict, from the assassination that triggered the First World War through multiple 20th century civil wars and ethnic conflicts. It sits directly across the narrow waters of the Aegean Sea from Turkey to the east, a fellow NATO ally with whom Greece has nonetheless maintained a long, complicated, and at times openly tense relationship stretching back generations, rooted in centuries of shared and contested history. And it holds a coastline and an extensive island chain that stretches across a significant portion of the eastern Mediterranean, controlling maritime approaches and air corridors that matter enormously to naval and air planners on every conceivable side of any regional conflict scenario NATO has ever had to seriously wargame. Defense analysts writing about Greek military spending consistently point to this specific, unusual geography and to the country's long history with Turkey specifically as the primary driver behind decades of Greek defense spending that looks disproportionate, even genuinely excessive, for a country of its modest economic size and population when compared against nearly any other European nation of similar scale. In 1988, Greece spent 4.2% of its entire gross domestic product on defense, a higher share than any other Western European country except Cyprus, itself a nation with its own acute and directly relevant security concerns given the continued, unresolved division of the island. By 2000, when most Western European nations had cut their defense spending well below 2% of GDP in the broad post-Cold War drawdown that swept across the entire continent As the perceived Soviet threat evaporated and governments everywhere redirected budgets toward other national priorities, Greece was still spending 3.6%, a figure most of its NATO peers had abandoned nearly a decade earlier as fiscally unnecessary given the changed strategic landscape of the 1990s. That pattern doesn't meaningfully reverse in the years that follow, even as Greece's own economy goes through multiple serious downturns and crises. Greece remains, year after year, decade after decade, one of NATO's consistently highest per GDP defense spenders, reliably sitting among the small handful of alliance members who actually meet or exceed NATO's own stated 2% of GDP spending target, a target the clear majority of NATO's member nations have struggled or simply declined to hit for years or even decades at a stretch, a fact that has periodically drawn public praise from American officials and NATO leadership, specifically pointing to Greece as one of the few members genuinely pulling its weight by the alliance's own stated financial standard. Into that sustained, decades-long spending pattern, the Leopard tank enters Greek service for the first time in 1983 and 1984, with an initial acquisition of roughly 104 to 106 Leopard 1 A3GR tanks, upgraded with Greek-specific modifications, including a locally integrated EMES 12A3 fire control system tailored specifically to Greek operational requirements and terrain. It's a modest first step. On paper, a single batch of just over 100 tanks entering an already substantial existing armored force built primarily around American hardware accumulated over the preceding decades. Nobody looking at that initial 1983 purchase order, a fairly routine piece of Cold War-era NATO defense procurement between allied nations, could have reasonably predicted where this specific acquisition relationship between Greece and the Leopard platform would eventually end up decades later. What happens over the following 2 decades is less a single dramatic acquisition and more a steady, almost relentless accumulation, deal after deal, upgrade program after upgrade program, each one individually modest and defensible on its own terms, that eventually produces a fleet-size nobody outside specialist defense circles seems to fully register or believe when they first hear the actual number stated plainly and directly. Between 1998 and 2000, Greece acquires 192 additional previously owned Leopard 1A5 tanks through what defense procurement records specifically categorize as an offset agreement, a compensatory benefit arrangement, rather than a simple, straightforward barter of goods, tied directly to 2 other major Greek defense programs running simultaneously during this same period. The Peace Icarus 2000 upgrade of Greece's own F-4 Phantom fighter fleet, and separate contracts involving Greece's Miko 200 frigates, a class of modern German-designed warships Greece was acquiring around the same time. Within that broader offset structure, tank transfers effectively offset costs elsewhere in Greece's much larger, multi-domain defense relationship with Germany, spanning air, sea, and land procurement simultaneously. It's a genuinely efficient piece of military procurement from Greece's perspective, the kind of quietly clever, multi-layered deal that defense budget analysts tend to admire even when they remain skeptical of the broader spending patterns surrounding it. Greece gains nearly 200 additional main battle tanks folded into a much larger package of defense industrial cooperation spanning multiple branches of its military simultaneously rather than requiring a standalone cash purchase that would have demanded a far more direct and immediately visible budget commitment. In 2001, the Greek army begins planning a further, considerably more ambitious upgrade program, intending to modernize 104 Leopard 1A 4GR tanks and a further 120 Leopard 1V variants up to a new A5 plus standard. At an estimated cost of $234 million, a substantial single-line item even by the standards of Greece's already elevated defense budget, representing years of anticipated engineering and modernization work on existing hulls. That specific program, notably, eventually gets cancelled entirely, not because Greece decides at some point that it needs fewer or less capable tanks, a conclusion that would have been entirely consistent with the country's broader spending restraint elsewhere, but because a better opportunity arrives first and effectively supersedes the original plan before it can be fully executed. Greece receives an additional batch of 150 more Leopard 1A5 tanks, alongside newly manufactured Leopard 2 A6HEL tanks, Greece's own localized production designation for the considerably more modern Leopard 2 variant, effectively leapfrogging the entire planned 1A4 to 1A5 plus upgrade program rather than spending hundreds of millions of dollars incrementally improving older vehicles when genuinely newer, more capable tanks are becoming available through a different acquisition channel entirely at roughly the same time. By the time this settles into a stable fleet composition through the 2000s and much of the 2010s, Greece's Leopard 1 fleet alone stands at roughly 520 vehicles, making it the single largest operator of the type anywhere in the world, ahead of Turkey's 397, Brazil's 378, and Chile's 202, meaning the next three largest operators of this exact tank combined still don't quite match Greece's total on their own. Layer on top of that a separate distinct fleet of roughly 170 Leopard 2A6 tanks, a genuinely more modern and capable variant. Journalist Elizabeth Braw, writing in a widely cited 2017 Foreign Affairs analysis titled "Tanking Up in Greece," lays out the raw comparison plainly and directly. Greece's 170 Leopard 2 A6s set against Germany's own 225, and she specifically names Greece the undisputed tank champion when the fleet is measured per 100,000 residents, a per capita framing rather than a direct claim about proportional force structure in the more technical military sense. That per capita comparison is the real, precisely sourced basis for the irony driving this entire story. The country that designed and manufactured the Leopard tank platform from scratch, that built the factories and trained the engineers, does not per capita field anywhere near the tank density that Greece does, despite Germany still owning more Leopard 2A6 in raw absolute numbers. Total tank numbers across Greece's entire armored force, combining active Leopards with whatever older American-supplied M47, M48, and M60 tanks, remain in reserve status rather than frontline active service, are cited by different sources at different points in time as anywhere from roughly 850 active tanks with several hundred more held in reserve, up to a combined total figure of 1,341 main battle tanks, counting everything Greece owns outright across every category and condition. It's worth being genuinely clear and precise here that these numbers, stable and largely unchanged for the better part of 2 decades, have become dynamic and actively shifting specifically since 2023, for reasons the next act explains in direct detail, rather than leaving as a vague, static total that no longer fully reflects reality on the ground. If you want more stories like this one, real numbers, real procurement history, verified carefully against multiple independent defense sources rather than repeated second-hand from a single, unverified claim. Subscribe. There's a considerable amount more sitting quietly in defense records, offset agreements, and procurement archives that rarely gets explained anywhere with this level of actual specificity and proper sourcing. The sheer scale of Greece's tank fleet creates its own genuine, well-documented problem, entirely separate from the acquisition story itself, one that Greek defense planners have had to reckon with openly and publicly in recent years rather than quietly ignore. Maintaining more than 1,000 main battle tanks in any meaningful state of combat readiness is extraordinarily expensive, and multiple defense analysts, including retired British Army Brigadier Ben Barry, speaking specifically about the Greek fleet in published commentary, have pointed out that the ongoing maintenance cost of an armoured force this size often exceeds what it originally cost to acquire the vehicles in the first place, particularly once you account for the specialized suspension components, transmission systems, and armor maintenance that heavier armored vehicles demand compared to lighter, mechanically simpler military hardware. Greece's own defense establishment has openly acknowledged, particularly during the country's severe and prolonged economic crisis through the 2010s, a period that forced drastic, genuinely painful cuts to pension payments and public spending across nearly every other sector of Greek government and public life, that keeping every tank in this enormous fleet fully battle-ready simultaneously simply isn't realistically sustainable given the resources actually available at any given moment, even as the country has continued, year after year, budget cycle after budget cycle, to resist any serious reduction in the fleet's overall stated size, a genuine ongoing tension between fiscal reality and an apparently deeply held strategic commitment to maintaining this specific capability regardless of cost. This tension between an enormous, expensive-to-maintain fleet and genuine ongoing budget constraints has pushed Greece toward a different kind of decision in more recent years, one that offers a partial, genuinely clever solution to the underlying maintenance burden rather than simply reducing the fleet outright, and one that directly explains why the fleet total is currently in active transition rather than a fixed number. In 2023, Greece agreed to transfer approximately 100 Leopard 1A5 tanks to Ukraine, structured through a triangular exchange arrangement involving Germany, in which those specific Greek tanks would be released for transfer in exchange for ex-Italian Leopard 1A5 tanks undergoing comprehensive refurbishment, with the associated upgrade and refurbishment costs covered entirely by the German government rather than falling on Greece's own defense budget. It's a solution that lets Greece retain its overall fleet size and combat capability over time, while allowing some of its older, harder-to-maintain vehicles to be cycled out of Greek service entirely, replaced with freshly refurbished equivalents at minimal direct cost to Greece itself. A genuinely efficient piece of trilateral defense diplomacy that manages to solve real, distinct problems simultaneously for all three governments involved. As this exchange continues being implemented in stages, Greece's active Leopard 1 count sits in genuine, ongoing transition rather than the static 520 figure that held remarkably stable for the better part of 2 decades before this arrangement began. As of the most recent defense industry reporting available, Greece continues actively evaluating upgrade programs for its Leopard 1 fleet specifically, including proposals for entirely new engines to replace the original MTUMB 838CAM 500 power plants that have driven this fleet for decades. On September 4, 2024, Rolls-Royce, MTU's parent company, alongside the specialized firm FFG, formally announced a repowering concept for the Leopard 1, driven specifically by the fact that the original engine is no longer in production anywhere and simply cannot be sourced new, creating a genuine, practical sustainability problem for a fleet this large and this mechanically aged after more than 4 decades of continuous Greek service. Proposals currently under active consideration include a new production version of the Aspis modular armor package designed specifically for the Leopard 1 hull, new fire control systems, updated day and night gun sights, and even anti-drone technology incorporating hard lessons learned directly from the ongoing war in Ukraine. A clear and consistent signal that despite the fleet's considerable age and well-documented maintenance cost, Greece has no near-term intention of retiring a force this large or meaningfully reducing its overall armored capability, choosing instead to keep investing in extending the operational life of tanks first purchased more than 4 decades earlier. What makes this story genuinely worth telling isn't really the tanks themselves, as impressive and specific as the raw numbers are on their own. It's the pattern underneath the number. Decades of consistent, disciplined, at times almost stubborn, military spending by a country that, by most conventional economic measures, arguably couldn't fully afford it, driven by a strategic calculation about its own geography, its own regional security environment, and its own complicated history that outside observers and defense analysts have debated openly for decades without ever fully resolving whether the scale of this specific investment has actually been the right call for a country of Greece's size and economic capacity. This channel exists because the archives, and in this specific case, the defense procurement records, offset agreements, and upgrade contracts most people never think to look into, genuinely have more depth, more specificity, and more real detail than most casual observers ever assume exists anywhere in this space. Subscribe if you want us to keep pulling threads like this one, verified, properly sourced against multiple independent references, and rarely explained anywhere else with this level of actual specificity. Thank you for giving this story the attention it genuinely earned. A tank fleet this size, sustained this consistently for this many decades, and now actively transitioning through a wartime exchange program with real strategic consequences of its own, doesn't happen by accident. Understanding exactly why it exists, one procurement decision, one offset agreement, one cancelled and superseded upgrade program at a time, tells you something real and specific about the country that built it.